In a Chinese weapons testing facility, 2008, engineers proudly displayed their newest creation, a perfect copy of America's AT4 anti-tank launcher, reverse-engineered from specimens acquired through shadowy channels. "Fire when ready," the test commander ordered. The soldier shouldered the launcher, aimed at a target tank 100 meters away, and squeezed the trigger. What happened next? A catastrophic explosion that killed one engineer and wounded 3 soldiers would expose years of technical fraud, manufacturing incompetence, and a Chinese military desperately trying to hide the fact that they couldn't copy even a disposable American weapon.
The weapon worth stealing. The AT4 is, by military standards, a remarkably simple weapon. Developed by Sweden's Saab Bofors Dynamics in the 1980s and adopted by the U.S. military, it's a single-shot, disposable anti-tank weapon designed to be used once and discarded. A soldier shoulders the fiberglass tube, aims through simple iron sights, and fires an 84mm high-explosive anti-tank warhead at armored vehicles, bunkers, or fortifications. The launcher weighs about 15 pounds, costs roughly $1,500, and requires minimal training to use effectively. But simple doesn't mean easy to manufacture. The AT4's effectiveness comes from precision engineering. The shaped charge warhead must detonate at exactly the right standoff distance to generate a penetrating jet of molten metal. The rocket motor must provide consistent thrust without wobbling or tumbling. And the launcher tube must withstand firing pressures while keeping the weapon light enough for infantry to carry. Get any of these wrong, and you have an expensive piece of junk that's dangerous to the user and ineffective against targets. By the mid-2000s, American AT4s had proven themselves in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. They could penetrate most armored vehicles, destroy fortified positions, and were reliable under harsh field conditions. Chinese military observers watched with envy as U.S. infantry effectively employed AT4s in urban combat, situations where heavy anti-tank weapons were too cumbersome, but rifle fire was inadequate. China's own infantry anti-tank weapons were outdated. The Type 69 RPG was a crude copy of the Soviet RPG-7, effective but requiring skill to use accurately. The Type 80 recoilless rifle was powerful but heavy and unwieldy. What Chinese infantry needed was something like the AT4, lightweight, simple, effective, and suitable for mass production. But Chinese attempts to develop indigenous disposable anti-tank weapons had consistently failed due to technical problems with rocket motors, warhead fusing, and launcher tube construction. The solution, as it so often was for Chinese weapons development, was to steal the technology. Through a combination of intelligence operations, corrupt procurement officials in third countries, and exploitation of commercial markets, Chinese agents acquired several AT4 launchers by 2006. Some were inert training versions purchased through gray market dealers. Others were live weapons that had gone missing from military stockpiles in conflict zones. All were immediately shipped to China for examination and reverse engineering.
The deceptive simplicity. Senior engineer Zhao Mingyue received the AT4 specimens in early 2007 at the China North Industries Corporation, NORINCO, facility in Baotou, Inner Mongolia. At first glance, the AT4 seemed almost too simple to be effective. The launcher was just a reinforced fiberglass tube with basic sights, a firing mechanism, and a shoulder rest. How hard could it be to copy?
"This is not a sophisticated weapon," Zhao told his assembled team during initial examination. "It's a tube that launches a rocket. We've been building rockets for decades.
We should be able to replicate this within a year and have production models within 2 years. This confidence, born of hubris and ignorance, would prove spectacularly misplaced. What Zhao and his team didn't understand was that the AT4's simplicity was deceptive. Every component had been optimized through years of development and testing. The materials, dimensions, and manufacturing processes reflected accumulated expertise that couldn't be discerned by examining finished products. The team began by completely disassembling the captured AT4s. They documented every component, measured every dimension, and analyzed every material. The fiberglass launcher tube was examined microscopically to determine fiber composition and resin chemistry. The rocket motor was carefully disassembled to analyze propellant composition and grain geometry. The shaped charge warhead was cross-sectioned to study the explosive type, liner configuration, and fusing mechanism. Each analysis revealed complexity hidden beneath apparent simplicity. The fiberglass tube wasn't just any fiberglass. It used specific glass fiber types woven in particular patterns and impregnated with specialized resins that provided strength while maintaining light weight. The propellant wasn't standard rocket fuel, but a carefully formulated mixture that provided consistent thrust across a wide temperature range. The shaped charge liner was precision-formed from copper with specific purity requirements and thickness tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Every component is optimized, reported materials specialist Dr. Wang Fang after months of analysis. The Americans didn't just design this weapon, they engineered every detail for optimal performance. We can identify what materials they used, but manufacturing equivalence with our industrial capabilities will be challenging. Wang's concerns were noted, but largely dismissed. Chinese leadership had ordered development of an AT4 copy, designated PF-08, and failure was not acceptable. The program had political momentum and nationalist fervor behind it. Engineers who suggested that the task was beyond Chinese manufacturing capabilities were accused of defeatism and lack of confidence in Chinese industrial prowess.
The manufacturing compromises. Production of PF-08 prototypes began in mid-2007, and problems emerged immediately. The fiberglass launcher tubes proved exceptionally difficult to manufacture to AT4 standards. Chinese fiberglass production used different fiber types and resin chemistries than the Swedish-American originals. The resulting tubes were either too heavy, negating the weight advantage of a disposable launcher, or too weak, risking structural failure during firing. We're using Chinese fiberglass that's similar to, but not identical with, what the Americans use, the manufacturing supervisor explained. Our tubes weigh about 18 pounds compared to the AT4's 15 pounds. We could make them lighter, but then we're not confident they could withstand firing pressures safely. The rocket motor presented different challenges. The propellant grain had to provide consistent thrust while burning smoothly without creating pressure spikes that could damage the launcher or destabilize the rocket in flight. Chinese propellant chemistry had improved significantly over previous decades, but formulating a propellant that matched AT4 performance across wide temperature ranges proved difficult. Test firings of early propellant batches revealed inconsistencies. Some batches produced too much thrust, causing excessive pressure in the launcher tube. Others produced insufficient thrust, meaning the rocket wouldn't reach adequate velocity for effective target engagement. Temperature sensitivity was worse. Propellants that worked acceptably at room temperature might fail at the temperature extremes of -40 degrees Celsius to +50 degrees Celsius that the AT4 was designed to handle. Our propellant works adequately under controlled conditions, reported the propulsion engineer.
but it's not as robust as the American propellant. Temperature affects our formulation more significantly. In very cold conditions, thrust is reduced. In very hot conditions, pressure can spike dangerously. We need more development time to optimize the formula. Time was exactly what the program didn't have. Political pressure demanded rapid progress, and engineers were told to proceed with available propellant rather than spending months or years on optimization. The decision would have fatal consequences. The shaped charge warhead was the most problematic component. A shaped charge works by focusing explosive energy into a high-velocity jet of molten metal that can penetrate armor. The effectiveness depends on precise geometry, consistent explosive performance, and a copper liner formed with extreme precision. Chinese explosives manufacturing had improved, but achieving the consistency required for reliable shaped charge performance remained challenging. The warhead is our biggest concern, admitted weapons effects specialist Major Li Jun. We can build shaped charges that sometimes work well, but consistency is poor. One warhead might penetrate 400 millimeters of armor. The next might only penetrate 250 millimeters. This variability comes from inconsistencies in explosive density, liner forming, and fuse timing. Soldiers need to know that when they fire the weapon, it will perform as expected. We can't guarantee that yet. Again, concerns were noted and dismissed. The program would proceed with available technology. Quality control would identify and reject substandard warheads. The PF-08 might not match AT4 reliability, but it would be adequate for Chinese needs, or so leadership assured themselves.
The fatal test. By early 2008, NORINCO had produced approximately 50 PF-08 prototypes for testing and evaluation. The weapons looked superficially similar to the AT4, the same general size and configuration, similar weight, comparable specifications on paper. Senior military officials were invited to witness live-fire demonstrations that would validate the PF-08 and clear the way for mass production. The test was scheduled for March 15, 2008 at a weapons range in Inner Mongolia. A target, an obsolete Type 59 tank, was positioned 100 meters from the firing line. Observers gathered in a reinforced bunker with viewing ports. The first soldier selected to fire the PF-08, Corporal Chen Wei, had been carefully chosen, experienced with anti-tank weapons, skilled, reliable. He shouldered the launcher, aimed through the sights, and waited for the order to fire. What happened next occurred in seconds, but seemed to unfold in slow motion for those watching. Chen squeezed the trigger. The firing mechanism activated, igniting the rocket motor. But instead of launching smoothly from the tube as designed, the rocket exploded inside the launcher. The fiberglass tube disintegrated, sending fragments in all directions. The explosion drove chunks of fiberglass, metal, and burning propellant backward toward Chen and the observers. Chen was thrown backward by the blast, his shoulder shattered by the explosion and his body peppered with fragments. An engineer standing behind the firing position, senior technician Liu Yang, was struck in the neck by a large fragment of fiberglass and collapsed, blood spurting from a severed artery. 3 other soldiers were wounded by secondary fragments. Medics rushed forward, but there was nothing they could do for Liu Yang. He bled out within minutes, despite desperate attempts to stop the hemorrhaging. Chen survived, but would spend months in the hospital and never regain full use of his right arm. The other wounded soldiers recovered, but carried scars from the incident. The test was immediately suspended. Senior officials, shaken by what they'd witnessed, ordered a comprehensive investigation. The destroyed launcher and recovered fragments were carefully collected for analysis, and engineers began the grim task of determining What had gone wrong?
The cascade of failures. The investigation revealed not a single failure, but a cascade of problems that combined with catastrophic results. The root cause was propellant that generated excessive chamber pressure, far beyond what the launcher tube was designed to withstand. This occurred because the propellant batch used in the test had been improperly mixed, creating density inconsistencies that caused uneven burning and pressure spikes. Quality control had failed to detect the problem because testing procedures were inadequate, and inspectors faced pressure to pass marginal batches to meet production quotas. The launcher tube, while structurally adequate for normal pressure, couldn't handle the excessive pressure generated by the defective propellant. The rocket motor design had insufficient safety margins. The Americans had engineered redundancy and safety factors into the AT4 that Chinese engineers had eliminated to save cost and weight. But the investigation revealed deeper problems beyond the immediate cause of the accident. The PF-08 prototypes showed systemic quality issues that suggested the design itself was fundamentally flawed. Launcher tube strength varied significantly from weapon to weapon, indicating inconsistent manufacturing processes. Propellant performance was unpredictable, with wide variations in thrust and pressure between batches. Warhead reliability was poor, with many warheads failing to detonate or detonating prematurely. The fusing mechanism was unreliable, sometimes activating too early, causing premature detonation, or too late, rendering the warhead ineffective. Components that should have been interchangeable weren't, indicating poor manufacturing tolerances. The PF-08 is not ready for service, the investigation report concluded. It suffers from fundamental design flaws and manufacturing quality problems that make it unsafe for soldiers to use. Continuing the program would require comprehensive redesign, development of new manufacturing processes, and significantly improved quality control. This would take years and require resources that may exceed what developing an indigenous design from first principles would cost.
The political aftermath. The investigation's conclusions created a political crisis. The PF-08 program had been promoted as demonstrating Chinese ability to rapidly field weapons equivalent to American systems through reverse engineering. Admitting comprehensive failure would suggest that Chinese manufacturing capabilities remained inferior to Western standards, an acknowledgement that contradicted official narratives of Chinese technical prowess. The solution was predictable. Classify everything. The accident was declared a state secret. Liu Yang's family was told he died in an industrial accident, but given no details. The wounded soldiers were transferred to military hospitals where their treatment records were classified. Engineers involved in the program were reminded of secrecy obligations and warned that discussing the failure could constitute revealing state secrets, a crime carrying severe penalties. The PF-08 program was quietly canceled in mid-2008, although official records were vague about reasons. Some documents suggested the design was, quote, undergoing further development. Others mentioned, quote, evolving requirements that made the original design obsolete. The truth, that the program failed catastrophically and killed someone, was buried in classified files. Zhao Mingyue, the program's technical director, was removed from his position but avoided harsher punishment. He had followed orders, pursued objectives established by superiors, and the failure could be attributed to systemic problems rather than individual incompetence. He was reassigned to less critical work, his career effectively over, but his liberty and salary preserved. The prototypes that hadn't been destroyed were scrapped, with components broken down and recycled to prevent any possibility of their existence becoming public knowledge. Technical documentation was collected and classified at the highest levels, and the Chinese military quietly purchased Russian-made RPG-29 launchers to meet needs that the PF-08 had been intended to fulfill.
The broader pattern. The PF-08 failure was part of a larger pattern of Chinese attempts to reverse engineer Western weapons that produced inferior results at high cost. The same dynamics appeared repeatedly. Acquisition of Western weapons through legal or illegal means. Overconfident assessment that reverse engineering would be straightforward. Discovery that Western weapons incorporated sophisticated technologies and manufacturing processes that couldn't be easily replicated. Pressure to proceed despite technical problems because admitting failure was politically unacceptable. Production of weapons that looked similar to Western originals but performed poorly or were unsafe. Accidents or failures that exposed the problems. Classification of failures and punishment or reassignment of those involved. This pattern reflected fundamental weaknesses in Chinese military-industrial development. The focus on reverse engineering rather than indigenous development meant that Chinese engineers never developed deep understanding of principles underlying weapon design. They could copy what they saw, but couldn't innovate or adapt when circumstances changed. The political environment made honest technical assessment dangerous. Engineers who warned that objectives were unattainable risked being labeled as defeatists or lacking revolutionary spirit. This created incentives to hide problems until they became catastrophic, as happened with the PF-08 test accident. Manufacturing quality control remained weak despite improvements. Production facilities faced pressure to meet quotas and political objectives, with quality taking second priority. Inspectors who rejected too many defective items faced criticism for hampering production. The result was weapons that looked acceptable but contained hidden flaws that revealed themselves during use.
The long-term consequences. China did eventually develop effective disposable anti-tank weapons, but through a different approach. Rather than trying to copy the AT4, Chinese engineers studied the underlying principles and developed indigenous designs suited to Chinese manufacturing capabilities. The PF-11 disposable launcher, introduced in the mid-2010s, was effective despite being quite different from the AT4 in configuration and operation. We learned that copying doesn't work when you don't understand the principles, a Chinese defense industry official said in an internal review years later. The PF-08 failed because we tried to replicate Western manufacturing without having the industrial base to support it. When we finally developed our own designs optimized for our capabilities, we succeeded, but we wasted years and resources trying to take shortcuts. The human cost of the PF-08 program extended beyond Liu Yang's death and the injuries to other personnel. The failure reinforced cynicism among engineers about their leadership's commitment to technical excellence versus political objectives. It demonstrated that speaking truth about technical limitations was dangerous, discouraging honest assessment of capabilities. And it showed that the political system valued appearance over substance. Weapons that looked impressive mattered more than weapons that worked reliably. For Western intelligence services, the PF-08 failure provided valuable insights into Chinese military-industrial weaknesses. It confirmed that Chinese manufacturing quality control remained problematic. It showed that reverse engineering Western weapons was harder than Chinese leadership acknowledged, and it suggested that Chinese military equipment might look impressive on parade grounds, but harbor hidden deficiencies that would become apparent in actual combat use.
The lessons China struggled to learn. The fundamental lesson of the PF-08 disaster, the technological capability can't be stolen but must be developed through patient, systematic effort, took decades for Chinese military-industrial leadership to fully internalize. The temptation to take shortcuts through reverse engineering remained strong because indigenous development was slow, expensive, and politically less attractive than claiming to match Western capabilities quickly. But repeated failures eventually forced changes in approach. By the 2010s, Chinese weapons development increasingly emphasized indigenous design informed by study of foreign systems rather than crude copying. Manufacturing quality control improved significantly, driven by recognition that substandard weapons endangered Chinese soldiers and undermined military effectiveness. And the political environment became slightly less hostile to honest technical assessment, though engineers still faced risks when reporting problems. The AT4 launcher that inspired the failed PF-08 continues in service with U.S. and allied forces, having proven reliable across decades of use in various conflicts. More than 600,000 have been produced, demonstrating that good design combined with quality manufacturing creates weapons that endure. The Chinese attempt to copy it failed because they lacked the industrial ecosystem and accumulated expertise that made the AT4 successful. That ecosystem, sophisticated material science, precision manufacturing, rigorous quality control, and accumulated institutional knowledge cannot be replicated by examining finished products. It must be built through long-term investment in education, research, industrial development, and quality systems. China eventually made those investments, but only after expensive failures like the PF-08 demonstrated that shortcuts didn't work.
The forgotten casualty. Lu Yang, the engineer killed during the PF-08 test accident, is buried in a cemetery in Baotao. His gravestone makes no mention of how he died, only his dates of birth and death and a generic inscription about service to the nation. His family received a modest pension, but was told they could not discuss the circumstances of his death due to state security concerns. Those who knew him remember a dedicated engineer who had expressed private concerns about the PF-08 program, but felt powerless to change its direction. He understood that the design had problems, but speaking up risked his career and possibly his freedom. So he continued working, hoping that problems would be discovered through testing before anyone was hurt. The March 2008 test proved his hopes were in vain. Lu's death was not heroic sacrifice in defense of the nation, but pointless tragedy resulting from political pressure overriding technical judgment. He died because Chinese leadership demanded impossible achievements on unrealistic timelines, because engineers couldn't safely report problems, and because quality control systems failed to catch defects that should never have reached testing. His death represented the human cost of a system that valued appearance over substance and political objectives over technical reality. More than 15 years later, the PF-08 program remains largely unknown even within China. The failure was successfully covered up, with few people aware that China once attempted to copy the AT4, and that the attempt ended in death and disaster. But those who worked on the program or investigated the failure remember, carrying lessons about the costs of hubris, the dangers of copying without understanding, and the price paid by those caught between impossible political demands and unforgiving technical reality. The AT4 remains in production and use worldwide, a simple but effective weapon that does exactly what it was designed to do. The PF-08 exists only in classified files and in the memories of those who witnessed its failure, a reminder that some capabilities cannot be stolen, that good design requires more than copying appearance, and that technological shortcuts often lead to disasters that cost far more
than the patient work of genuine development.